All right, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to raise the awareness of trauma and to support and inspire new trauma therapists just starting out on the trauma-informed journey. I do that with my membership community, Trauma Therapist 2.0, my online courses and workshops, and the Trauma Therapist newsletter. If you're a therapist of any kind and you work with individuals who've been impacted by trauma, I invite you to head on over to my website at thetraumatherapistproject.com. That's thetraumatherapistproject.com. All right, let's get started. Ilene, are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right, here we go. So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. Guy McPherson here, and very excited to have as my guest today, Ilene Smith. Ilene, welcome.
Thank you.
All right. So, Ilene, I'm going to read your bio here, and I'm going to start by quoting you on your website here. You say, I believe that 80% of mental health issues are the result of unresolved trauma trapped in the body. I believe that everyone has a potential to heal. I believe that when an individual can find safety in themselves, they develop a more meaningful relationship with themselves and with others. A world less with trauma is a world with more connection. It's a vital world in which each interaction is more meaningful and vital. A world with less trauma is a world with more freedom. Ilene is a Somatic Experiencing Practitioner. She's completed a 3-year training with the Somatic Experiencing Institute, of course, founded by Peter Levine. She's also a certified professional coach. She's passed the National Clinical Mental Health Counseling Examination. All right, Ilene, just a little bit about you before we get going here. Share with the listeners where you're from originally and where you are currently.
Okay, so I am originally from New York, and I currently live in Scottsdale, Arizona.
Okay, why'd you move?
Oh, well, like most things in my life, it was an accident, but I never thought I'd stay here, and I've been here 19 years. So I call Scottsdale home.
Okay, awesome. I'm originally from New York as well.
I love that.
Awesome.
Love the New Yorkers.
All right, Ilene. So look, we get right into it here. How the heck did you get into this field? Why and the specialization?
So I went back to school in my early 40s to become a therapist. So as I'm moving through the process and doing an internship, I was placed through my internship at an eating disorder clinic.
Okay, hang on. I have to stop you. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Why did you decide to become a therapist at 40?
I felt like it was something I had always wanted to do, and I had done a lot of my own work. And I just felt like I was really ready to be of service to other people and be able to give back in that way.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So I was introduced to somatic experiencing. Obviously, working at an eating disorder clinic, you're going to deal with a lot of trauma. And actually, I've never seen an eating disorder patient, including myself, who hasn't had a history of trauma. And I started learning about somatic experiencing. And for those of you your listeners who don't know, somatic experiencing is a body-based therapeutic modality. And basically what we believe in somatic experiencing is that trauma is not about the events, but it's about that energy that gets locked in the body around real or perceived threat. And when we have this trauma energy locked in the body, the nervous system becomes dysregulated. And I started going through the trainings, and it just felt like it was the missing link to talk therapy, right? We do a lot of talk therapy, which is all top down, which we're working with the highest functioning parts of our brain. In somatic experiencing, we're working with the more primitive survival physiology that's locked in the body. So how I got into it is I just felt like it was a missing link. I mean, having done so much talk therapy myself and still feeling like there was these sort of the tectonic plates sort of always in my body. Like I was always sort of managing and trying to, it was more of a management issue to regulate myself. Mm-hmm. And as a student of the work, you also become a patient of the work. And I just couldn't believe how different I felt through the process of somatic experiencing. I felt like my body was more of a safe container than it had ever been. So that's a long answer to how I got into it.
Okay. So you said you got in, you wanted to be a therapist because you had done your own work and you were ready to be of service to others. Was your own work a result of the eating disorder?
It was a result of the eating disorder. It was a result of just never feeling really connected or safe. But, I had a lot of, for lack of a better way to explain it, a lot of issues, attachment issues. So a lot of anxious attachments. And, I really struggled throughout my life to feel like I was connected to myself and connected to the people around me.
Mm-hmm.
So the work was just a result of, I'm not comfortable here and something doesn't feel right. And what I learned later on is really what didn't feel right was a dysregulated nervous system from trauma that began very early on. I had I guess we can start in utero. My mom was totally dysregulated. And of course, a baby's nervous system is going to get co-regulated by what's going on, even in utero, by the mom. And then I had 2 eye surgeries, followed by a very chaotic childhood. So all of that accumulation was, left me feeling very disoriented in the world, and just with a very, very disrupted nervous system that was constantly living in this sympathetic overdrive. So constantly like living in like lots and lots of activation.
So at 40, you decide to go back, and that's no small feat. I went back to school when I was 36.
You did.
Yeah. And that's you're like, you've been out of it for a long time.
Yeah.
To get back. What was the catalyst for you to say, I want to go back, not just back to school, but back to be a therapist?
Well, it was a couple of things. So going back to that trauma piece, I walked into my therapist's office one day, probably around 38, 39. And I'm like, I just can't get stuff done. And I started just rambling off to him. I'm like, I feel like I make mistakes all the time. And he said to me, he's like, if he diagnosed me with ADHD. And at that time, I was like, okay, this finally makes sense. And he put me on Adderall, which I'm no longer on because my nervous system is now regulated. But my ADHD was probably a result, they call it ADHD, but really it's trauma brain.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I got on the Adderall, I was actually able to focus and concentrate. And I was like, you know what, I think I can actually do this. And I went back to school. And at that point, that just made the most sense to me that okay, like this I can do. I felt completely empowered. And eventually, through all the somatic work, I actually got off the Adderall. I'm no longer on it, and I wrote a book not being on it. So that was a pretty big feat.
So you get into school, you want to become a therapist. Did you say to yourself, I want to work with people who've been traumatized? How did things evolve for you?
Yeah. So I knew that I wanted to work with eating disorders, which also meant I was going to work with trauma. And I wanted to do some family work. So all of those things, when I shared that with my advisor, they had placed me at this eating disorder clinic. And that's, that really was the beginning of the journey for me. And so I still work a lot with eating disordered patients, and just a variety of a lot of anxiety. I deal with a lot of anxiety and depression.
When you said to yourself, I want to work with people who have eating disorders, who have experienced trauma, what was that? I mean, that's no small feat to say that, and it's no small feat to begin working with people who've been traumatized. How did you experience that?
It just felt so, it was just an organic, okay, this is what I'm supposed to be doing. It was really, and I think when something is a passion for you, or you feel connected to something, you just have a calling for it.
Yeah.
And for me, it wasn't even a question of whether this is what I should or shouldn't do. This is what I was going to do. So,
was there any fear there despite that calling?
No,
trepidation?
Not really. I felt really connected to the work and really connected to this population. And I felt, because of my own journey through eating disorder and healing, that I could relate to and really understand and feel into what these clients were experiencing.
Mm-hmm.
So
What helped you personally in your own healing journey?
really good question. Well, I would start with this. I think that the biggest piece of healing is a willingness. And for myself, the willingness really came from, I can't tolerate how I'm living and experiencing myself and the world around me. I can't, and with eating disorders, a lot of times there's this piece of interoception, which is how we experience our bodies from the inside out. And I'm like, I can't tolerate how I feel in my body. I'm like, something's got to change. So I believe we're willing to make those changes when we get uncomfortable enough. And for me, that discomfort was so intense that I was at a certain point just really willing to do anything I needed to find my way. And like everything, healing is not a one and done. It's really a journey. And I think that we go through layers of healing, and those layers build upon one another, and they help us create more resilience as we move through our life. And so when we go on to the next layer of healing, we have that foundation from the layer before.
So you're in school, you do that internship. What happens after that?
Okay, so I'll get into a little bit of my personal story here. I finished school. I'm now working at the eating disorder clinic, and I'm moving through the somatic experience training, which is a 3-year training. And I'm also a patient of the work, and my husband dies.
Oh boy.
Very suddenly. Yeah. And what happens next is all of the work that I had done as a patient of the somatic experiencing really helped me build a safe container enough for myself to get through what was probably the most devastating thing I had ever experienced in my life. So part of what happens next is I really immersed myself in my work. It really took me out of a lot of my pain, being able to help other people. And I realized, so much of what we do initially in somatic experiencing is education. And I felt like there was such a void in all of these self-help books and all of the information out there that people didn't really understand that trauma is that energy locked in the body, and that we need to work with the nervous system, and we need to bring the body into the healing process. So I eventually wrote a book on called Moving Beyond Trauma, and really trying to help people see that they can heal, but there has to be more to it than just talk therapy. So I continued at the eating disorder clinic and eventually went out and started my own practice, which I have now. And so I see patients, and I do some speaking engagements and really try to get the information out there to the public.
First of all, thank you for sharing that about your husband. I'm so sorry to hear that. Can I ask what happened?
Sure. He died very suddenly. He had what we believe is an abdominal aneurysm. So yeah, my life turned on a dime. So everything as I knew my life changed in about 3 seconds.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it was pretty devastating. But you learn if you build resilience in your system. Like for myself, the big thing for me, and it was the first time in my life that I was able to actually ask for help and allow people to support me. I didn't shut the world out. I stayed connected. My self-care was really good, and I got through it.
Your book, Moving Beyond Trauma, and we'll have this linked up at the show notes page here at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. It's available at Amazon, anywhere books can be purchased.
Amazon. Okay. Amazon's usually the easiest. It's available on audio and also in digital form.
Okay.
Yeah.
What was the impetus for writing the book?
So I just really felt like there wasn't enough information out there about trauma, and really helping people understand that what they're feeling or feeling a lack of disconnect in the world, or a lack of disorientation to the world, that there's an explanation for it. So I wanted people to be able to see that they're not alone. and what they're experiencing is a result of unresolved trauma, and that they can heal it. So that I really wanted to give people hope and an understanding of and create a roadmap for them to begin that journey.
Hope is huge.
Yeah, it is, isn't it?
We all need hope. I went to the doctor, an allergist today, and I said to him, look, I just need hope. Is there hope for me? And he said, yes, there's hope. And I just like,
relaxed.
Relaxed.
Right. Hope is everything, right?
Who's your book for? Is
My
it
book,
for the professional, the layperson, both?
It's really for the layperson, and maybe professionals that are doing more cognitive based therapies and want some more information. But I would say mostly for the layperson who's really trying to sort themselves out and begin to figure out how and where they're gonna start their healing journey. And then for them to also, in the book, I developed a whole series of assessments to help the reader piece together how their nervous system's functioning, so they can kind of begin to look at it, right? Because if we can see it, we can work with it. Mm-hmm. If we can't see it, we can't do anything about it.
How do you define trauma?
So trauma is really about the energy that gets locked in our bodies around real or perceived threat. So it's less about the event. The event, we always think about it as the event, but it's less about the event and more about what happens to the body when the body feels unsafe. And it kind of, when you think of it this way, it kind of explains why 10 people can have the same experience and have 10 different outcomes. And the degree to which we're going to be traumatized has to do with a couple of things. It's how safe we felt going into the experience and how safe we felt in the aftermath of the experience. And that's why, that's why it's so important for first responders to get to the scene of a natural disaster, right? Because we need to make those people that have gone through the experience, we need to help them feel safe as quickly as we can.
So how long have you been a therapist?
So I've been at this 8 years. Okay. 8 years, yeah.
And you talked about your own experience with trauma, with eating disorders, and Ilene, you strike me as someone who really gives of themselves in the work you do. You strike me as someone who really utilizes your own experience to connect with people. Would you say that's accurate?
That's very accurate. And I really believe that you can only take your clients as far as you're willing to go yourself. So I just feel like I can only be as good as the work that I've done on my own to help other people.
Now, I think, my belief is that in order to do those things that I was just talking about, to do them successfully, it takes a certain amount of courage and risk and vulnerability and creativity. Did you start out that way? When you started doing this, was there some small amount of protection, guarding in a sense of who you are?
I think I've always been pretty open and vulnerable. Maybe that's been my superpower, is that I've never been one to shy away from exploration and honesty and showing up with wherever I am and whatever is there at the time. So I would not say that there was any fear around, that part of the experience. I think there's always just this piece of really trying to attend and attune to your clients and meet them where they are in a non-judgmental way, just so that you can be with them. Because to me, that's the most important thing, is if you can attune to the people that you're trying to help. But I think that really comes from being able to attune to yourself.
And how do you do that? Or are there certain practices that you engage in on a daily basis, or what? How do
I
you
think
maintain that?
I think that I think self-care, like taking care of myself, taking care of my nervous system, taking care of my physical being, taking care of my emotional being. The more I'm aligned with myself, the better I am at what I'm doing.
Mm-hmm.
So it's all about that alignment.
So let's kind of shift gears here. I don't do this a lot, but I want to do this with you because I think pretty sure you can handle it.
Okay, bring it on.
You work a lot with people who've experienced eating disorders.
Correct.
And that topic, I honestly don't know much about. I mean, I know a little bit about it, but it has always intrigued me, specifically because, when in this field, when we talk about being drawn to the event or the behavior, that's one where the behavior is very much upfront and underlying. Most often, there's this trauma. Can you get specific about, and I'm not asking you to divulge or share any kind of personal stories from your clients, but can you give us an example of what it's like working in that field, in that instance?
So let me just start with saying one thing about eating disorders. Let's start with really what an eating disorder is. Okay, an eating disorder is basically a maladaptive way to try to manage intense feelings that you don't want to feel, or to get away from, or to check out from intense feelings, or to try to, or the other way too, like to try to feel if you're not feeling anything, if you're totally numbed out. So it's really not about the food or the behaviors. It's really about what's going on with the person on an emotional level. So a lot of times in treatment, what we're trying to do is, we're always like, stop the behavior, stop the behaviors, stop the behaviors. My feeling is, and yes, that's part of it, but we can't stop the behaviors if we don't work to regulate the nervous system. So nervous system regulation, to me, has to be the priority in working with eating disorders. And part of the nervous system regulation is getting the nervous system regulated, is working through the traumatic pieces that are unresolved. So that, to me, is sort of the focal point of working with eating disorders from a therapeutic standpoint. I mean, obviously there's a nutrition part and there's other things that go into it. Mm-hmm. But the big thing is we have to get the nervous system regulated.
So for example, and I realize all clients are unique and experiences are unique, someone presents and they're very concerned about their weight. Mm-hmm. Okay. How does that?
So that's going to show up with a lot of anxiety, right? And so again, if you think about what I'm saying, we have to manage the anxiety. We're not going to focus on the weight. We're not going to get the focus on the body or the weight. We're going to focus on working to reduce systemic anxiety so that they can tolerate if they put on a little weight. There's also another piece of that. I was mentioning this earlier, when we talk about that interoceptive piece, is how we experience our bodies from the inside out. So again, this is why the body-based therapeutic modalities are so important. We have to get the person to be able to sense their bodies a little bit more accurately so that they can tolerate those sensations of fullness or emptiness or whatever it is. So it's helping to create a more accurate interoceptive experience.
And again, is it safe to say that behind eating disorder, most often there's trauma?
I've never met an eating disorder patient that doesn't have trauma, a history of trauma, chronic stress and trauma. Yeah.
Okay. And when you say trauma, that could be what most often is that most often abuse? Is that could that be any kind of trauma?
So I'd like to think of it like this. Most of the time, what we see is complex PTSD. So what it is usually maybe there's birth trauma, depending upon the eating disorder, and then also chronic stress throughout childhood is usually what I see.
Okay. So, all right, as we kind of wind down here, you've been doing this for a while, have a lot of experience. There are so many modalities out there, right?
Yes,
right
so
now we're
many.
talking about sensory motor, but how does one decide which one to pursue?
That's a really good question. I think that depends where you wind up therapeutically, depending upon what the issues are, depending upon where your journey has been, where you want to go. I think we'll just help you figure that out.
Mm-hmm. And somatic experiencing, obviously, it seemed to find you in a sense.
Yeah, it definitely did, and I connected with this idea that we have to work with the body to really have ultimate healing.
Okay. All right. So as we kind of close out here, Ilene, how about a go-to book recommendation in addition to your own, which again, we'll have listed up here.
I like Peter Levine's In an Unspoken Voice. I think that's a very good book if you're looking for information on somatic experiencing and body-based therapies. The other one I really like is The Body Keeps Score by Bessel van der Kolk. Those are two books that will really give you a good understanding of body-based therapies.
Okay. And finally, how the heck are you doing in this whole pandemic age? How are you dealing with it personally?
What pandemic?
What pandemic? The COVID.
I'm doing
pandemic.
okay. I'm doing okay. Thank God. Yeah. I'm thank God for my health. So
yeah.
You.
Has it been stressing you out at all? I mean, for me, I was so freaking stressed out when this whole thing started. Certainly.
Yeah, I really stopped very quickly listening to the news. It was actually dysregulating my nervous system. And I said, no more. So I read a couple little 10 or 15 minutes in the news in the morning, and that was it, just reading. And
right.
So, but no television and listening to it, because you can make yourself crazy through the media.
That's what I did. Yeah. I did make myself crazy, and I had to stop just like yourself.
Yeah.
All right, Ilene. Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on here and sharing your experience. I mean, you just resonate this kind of authenticity and directness, which I think is so really valuable in this field.
Thank you.
Yeah, Thank you. I appreciate it. All right, be well. We'll be in touch.
All right. Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you so much for listening and supporting this podcast. And if you'd like to join the hundreds of other therapists who are each month keeping up to date and informed and inspired about what's going on in the world of trauma, I'd love to invite you to head on over to the Trauma Therapist newsletter. That's the traumatherapistnewsletter.com.